Tantor Audio presents Corruption in America, from Benjamin Franklin's Snuff Box to Citizens United, by Zephyr Teachout. Narrated by Joanna Perrin. Introduction. When Benjamin Franklin left Paris in 1785, after several years representing American interests in France, Louis XVI gave him a gorgeous parting gift. It was a portrait of King Louis, surrounded by 408 diamonds of a beautiful water, set in 2 wreathed rows around the picture, and held in a golden case of a kind sometimes called a snuff box. The snuff box and portrait were worth as much as 5 times the value of other gifts given to diplomats. One historian has called it the most precious treasure in Franklin's entire estate. It depicted the king with powdered hair and red cheeks, wearing white lace around his throat, 2 gold chains on his shoulders, and a blue robe with gold fleur-de-lis. In Europe, gifts were socially required upon a diplomat's departure. A valuable gift indicated a regent's great favor and a job well done. But in the new United States, the snuff box signified danger. Such a luxurious present was perceived as having the potential to corrupt men like Franklin, and therefore it needed to be carefully managed. In Europe, in other words, the gift had positive associations of connection and graciousness. In the United States, it had negative associations of inappropriate attachments and dependencies. The snuff box stood for friendship or old-world corruption, respect or bribery, depending on the perspective. For the Americans, it was a symbol of seduction, dependency, luxury, and a European confusion about the proper relationship between politics, power and intimacy, and friendship. According to an idiosyncratic anti-corruption rule in the Articles of Confederation, Franklin's present had to be approved by Congress, as did all gifts from foreign officials. By going through Congress and requiring a congressional stamp, the direct relationship between the king and Franklin was complicated, made public, and partially reconstituted as a relationship between Congress and Franklin. It was no longer in the realm of private reciprocity and relationships, but was instead a regulated transaction. As I will describe later, this rule was initially taken out of the proposed Constitution, but reinserted when some of the delegates to the convention worried that its absence threatened corruption. The argument of this book is that the gifts rule embodies a particularly demanding notion of corruption that survived through most of American legal history. This conception of corruption is at the foundation of the architecture of our freedoms. Corruption, in the American tradition, does not just include blatant bribes and theft from the public till, but encompasses many situations where politicians and public institutions serve private interests at the public's expense. This idea of corruption jealously guards the public morality of the interactions between representatives of government and private parties, foreign parties, or other politicians. The king's gift threatened this kind of corruption because it encouraged a positive, tacit relationship between France and Franklin, built on diamonds. This could interfere with Franklin's obligations to the country at large. No one charged the king's agent with explicit promises or threats. Instead, the worry was that intimate obligations that arise from large gifts could interfere with public commitments. Imagine anyone receiving a gift of 408 diamonds of the best water, and then a few hours later describing the gift-giver in unattractive terms. The recipient would sound rude, ungrateful, and ungracious. We expect that gifts lead to some warmth and generosity toward the giver, if not official favors. Such private generosity, however, could violate the posture that the diplomat is supposed to have toward the leadership of the host country. The allegiance ought be firmly to America. At the level of basic human intercourse, Franklin owed something to the king after receiving such a gift. These subtle sympathies threatened to corrupt Franklin because they could interfere with his responsibility to put the country's interest first in his diplomatic judgments, and cloud his judgments about French actions. The concern held even though Franklin never planned to return to his post. Americans started their experiment in self-government committed to expanding the scope of the actions that were called corrupt to encompass activities treated as non-corrupt in British and French cultures. Disappointed with Britain and Europe, Americans felt the need to constitute a political society with civic virtues and a deep commitment to representative responsiveness at the core. They enlisted law to help them do it, reclassifying non-corrupt normal behaviors from Europe as corrupt behaviors in America. During the Revolutionary period, the Americans not only created a new country, but crafted a powerful political grammar. The concept of corruption in Franklin's America drew on old traditions but augmented them and gave them power. He and his cohort believed that if you don't take care to support public emotional attachments of those in power, you can't build a representative government. When they spoke about corruption, the framers focused on the moral orientation of the citizens and representatives, the most essential building blocks of the Republican state. Other political traditions focus on the more material problems of stability, anarchy, inequality, or violence. The American one focuses on the virtues of love for the public and the dangers of unrestrained self-interest. As I show throughout this book, this commitment to a broad view of corruption stayed largely the same in the courts for the country's first 200 years. Corruption is often equated with modern criminal bribery and extortion law, with kickback arrangements between mayors and contractors, and with officials who accept cash to change votes. But it plays a larger social and political role. The snuff box incident demonstrated the belief that temptation and influence work in indirect ways, and that corruption is not merely transactional or quid pro quo, as it is sometimes called. The law that governed the portrait in a snuff box also exemplifies the founder's preference for a certain kind of anti-corruption rule. These rules, which I call structural or prophylactic, cover innocent activity as well as insidious transactions. They stand in contrast to laws that require corrupt intent to convict. They work through changing incentives before the fact, instead of punishing activity after the fact. In the Gifts Clause and dozens of other constitutional provisions, the framers built their bulwarks against corruption through structural rules. For instance, the residency requirement in the Constitution limits the freedom of people to run for Congress to where they live, but is a worthwhile rule because it protects, imperfectly but practically, against adventurers. Instead of requiring a jury to determine whether Franklin was, in fact, in secret communications with France, or whether there was, in fact, some whispered, explicit deal, the only demand the prophylactic gift rule makes is that no gift be given without congressional approval. The particular word corruption has a long tradition of playing an important role in our country's political transformation. Charges of corruption and its variants were an essential force in the creation of the Constitution and part of almost every debate about governmental structure. In the first 100 years of the Republic, the problem of corruption drove key decisions about how to structure government and business, and how to restrain self-interested legislators. Corruption rhetoric dominated the Jacksonian era. Corruption rallied people to pass several of the post-Civil War constitutional amendments, including the 17th Amendment, allowing for the direct election of senators, and the 27th Amendment, providing that congressional salary raises do not take effect until the beginning of the next session of Congress. Charges of system-wide corruption led to the 1880s antitrust statutes and the 20th century enforcement thereof. Corruption, corrupt, and related words were a major part of the grammar of the populists and the progressive reformers, and were accusations that supported the rise of prosecutorial post-Watergate culture. In its parallel life in the law, the concept of corruption has also been transformative. Legal disputes around the meaning of the concept of corruption, and in some cases the meaning of the words corruption, corrupt, or corruptly, have often been so vexing that they have forced courts to be inventive in other areas. This book focuses
Sample complete. Ready to continue?